Well, Life Group leaders, it's good to have you back with us this week as we take a look at our last of seven studies in the book of Job, which is one of the longer books in the Bible at 42 chapters. But we're going to be taking a look at the first 11 verses of chapter 42 with our lesson title of Dependence Declared. And really, as you see as we move through this, we're going to touch as well on the last 6 verses of chapter 42 also, because they speak quite a bit. It helps bring us kind of full circle with how we met Job and the position he was in and the position that he is restored to. And of course, as you know, next week we're going to start into 6 weeks of study in the book of Ecclesiastes, and it's appropriate that we take a look at these 2 books in the same quarter because we're taking a close look at 2 men and what they came to discover about God. And we might say that what they discovered about God, we could say about Job, that he discovered it even more deeply in the midst of incredible adversity and suffering. Right. And Solomon came to discover it after living a life of incredible affluence. So maybe we could say that a lesson from the book of Job is, or could be, through it all, God. And then in the book of Ecclesiastes, we could say, more than it all, God. And you could launch from there with a series of lessons. There are 2 people with very different views and experiences, and they conclude that God is greater than our adversities and certainly greater than our riches, no matter how great each may be. I'll get my act together here in just a minute. But one lesson that, or our lesson this week is taken from the last chapter of the book of Job. Again, that's chapter 42, where again we're going to be focusing on the first 11 verses. And just before we get into this lesson, one of the things I'm planning to do with my class, I haven't figured out exactly how I'm going to do it, but I'm going to do it briefly, is to provide a bit of a review of the book of Job and where we've been in it, because it's been kind of a quick trip through a long and deep book. But I might just mention briefly that we're going to cover, or I'm going to remind them of what we've been through in the book of Job. And I'm going to start with the conversation between God and Satan back in chapter 1 and chapter 2, Job's calamities that are described in great detail in those first 2 chapters. And then we get into that longer section of speeches of the 3 friends when they finally respond to Job's situation and give their opinions, faulty though they were in much of what they said. We're going to see Job's response to the speeches. We're going to see Job's response to Job, or we have seen God's response to Job. And then today we're going to talk about God's restoration of Job. So this kind of review, just to let everybody know kind of where we've been and what we're going to be talking about this week, might be helpful. And one of the things I'm going to do too, either at the beginning or at the end of my lesson, is ask the members of my class, what has stuck out from the book of Job? What have they learned that maybe they hadn't fully appreciated? And I want to get the feedback from them on that score. And kind of to that point, before I launch into the discussion this week, I'd like to get Tom and Gary's perspectives on that. What stuck out as we went through these 7 lessons from the book of Job? So guys, I just ask you to interject on that if you would.
Okay, you want to go? Me?
Go ahead.
Okay. Well, there's about 2 or 3 things that I pulled away from a pragmatic or practical perspective. One was kind of an affirmation that I felt like I'm at this level of my life, maturity, whatever that means, that I'm pretty solid when it comes to God's sovereign control, God's sovereign rule, where I realize as He's in control of everything, frankly, even evil, as challenging as that is to us. So that made me feel like I've made some progress in my sanctification, that I don't question everything, and that helped me. a couple other things that I came away with that I learned from this study was be careful of the advice you give others. And if I do give advice, try not to look through my personal lens as much as it would be through the lens of Scripture. While I may be well-intentioned, I can mislead someone because of a personal perspective that may not be theologically sound. And so it cautioned me a little bit, Tom. Be careful. The other thing also is this, that when I receive counsel, remember, Tom, they're not God, and they may not be coming from a biblical perspective, well-intentioned. Right. But may not be from a biblical perspective as well. So be careful of advice that you give. Be careful of advice that you receive. And then the last thing was, and I thought our lessons, we guys and Stu, as we covered some of these, I think we helped hopefully our students realize that when you're in the midst of incredible challenges, whether it's tragedy, whether it's trials, temptation, whatever it is, the quicker you shift from the introspective to the upward look, the better you're going to be. If I can shift out of my personal mode and begin to focus on God and remind myself that He is sovereign, then that helps me get over some of the trials that I may be going through. And I picked that up from our lesson.
One of the things I would just follow up with on there is it occurred to me, your first point about as we get older, we kind of learn more about, appreciate God's sovereignty. You know, it's hard sometimes to tell people that God is sovereign even in the midst of suffering.
Yeah.
But we learn it, and the longer we live, the older we get, the more we see His sovereignty and His grace through experiences. So being told it is one thing, learning it, going through it is another.
That's right. And it's not a passiveness. It's not just a throw up your hands and resign. Right. It's an active faith. God is in control of this. As painful as it is, as much as I don't like, I know that my Redeemer lives. And I know that it's going to be okay according to His plan. So, sorry, Gary, I hope I didn't steal your thunder.
Piggyback on what you were talking about. In fact, last week in our video, you made a couple of statements that, we start out with this God why question, and I think that's normal. But the sooner we can get to God what, and we spent quite a bit of time in our class on that, and it's a continuum, and I think and it kind of reinforces that we've got this me problem. God, why is this happening to me? Why me, Lord? Why? And I didn't like this, and I don't deserve this, and this is not fair. And we start out there when we're in these times of trials and suffering, but and some people stay stuck there and become bitter, angry, resentful. But we as Christians have got to move beyond that as quickly as possible. Like you said, there's a lady in our class posted a statement. I want to read it to us. It's at least to me, it's really powerful. It says, God leads us through life experiences that are designed to make us more like Him, and that doesn't always feel like it's for our best. However, it's important to remember God never said life would be easy or without trials. He's working all things together for good. We know Romans 8:28. Then here's the little quote. It's a beautiful moment when you realize that whatever God has chosen for you is ultimately better than anything you would have chosen for yourself.
Wow.
And I thought, good. Wow, that's so full of wisdom there. That's powerful, because that speaks to the God, what is it you want me to learn? God, what is it you want me to change and become better as a result of the trials and suffering I'm in? So that's kind of my takeaway from the whole book of Job, watching everything happen to him, and then at the end, in today's lesson, where he comes full circle, like you said, Richard, to this realization that God's in control, and He's got my good and whatever's best for me and mine for Him.
Good.
So,
that's really good.
It's good. So you may want to go through that with your class, see what they've got out of Job and things that they may have learned. I think it would be interesting as a teacher to hear as well. So let me just share with you how I'm planning to organize the lesson this week. again, it's not our style to actually teach the lesson to you, but to share some perspectives on it that maybe you can employ and use as you prepare your lesson. I find it easier for me. I hope it's useful for my class to organize around a couple of main points. I think I've mentioned somewhere between 2 and 4 is usually where I try to go. But I'm going to organize around 3 passages within this broader passage in chapter 42. And in Job 42, 1 through 6, I'm going to identify that as the confession and repentance of a blameless, upright man. And then Job 42, 7 through 9, just 3 verses there, I'm going to talk about God's rebuke of 3 fault-finding friends. And then in verses 10 and 11, and really we could expand that to the end of the chapter, I'm going to speak about God's restoration of his suffering servant. And just a couple of points under each one of those, and then I'm going to ask Tom and Gary to weigh in here. In verses 1 through 6, let me just go over a few points that I'm going to integrate into the lesson. And that would be the section I just entitled Confession and Repentance of a Blameless, Upright Man. You know, in these verses, we have Job humbling himself and confessing to God. You'll recall that Job's friends were calling on him to confess his, if you will, secret sins that they were sure that he had. It's Job, you must have done something. Right. And he searched himself and said, I don't understand. But what happens here in these verses 1 through 6 is Job does confess, but not to any sin or secret sin. He confesses to questioning God's sovereignty. And as such, he comes to acknowledge God's sovereignty. That's really what he's confessing to in these first 6 verses. And he is repenting of his attitude and again acknowledges God's power and this is important, his perfect justice with God's view that is much broader than ours. We tend to look at our own experiences. God's got a view that we can't even begin to fathom. And he did all this while still not understanding why he was suffering. And that's a point that the writer points out in the lesson in the book. Job never really understood.
Never did.
Why.
Yeah.
He never knew about the conversation that God had with Satan in the opening part of this book. And it seems that what we learn from that is that it teaches us that not understanding God and his ways is no excuse for not trusting God and his ways. I think that's an important point, because at some point we just have to, as Tom mentioned, kind of step back and say, leave it up to God. He knows best. And then I think that just to kind of put a close on that section in, is what we really learn is in all things and in all situations, we are to trust God. So those are some points you might want to integrate into the verses 1 through 6 in addition to what you're planning for your class. Secondly, looking at verses 7 through 9 in the section of God's rebuke of his 3 fault-finding friends. We came to know those 3 friends pretty well. I don't know about you, but there were times when I read what they were saying and I thought, yeah, that sounds like something I might say. Yeah. So we learned a lot about Job, but I think we learned a lot about friendship, and as Tom mentioned, be careful.
Yeah.
I have a friend who bloviates a lot. So
why did you look at me when you said
I look at Sean. Oh, how's that? Is that better? And so we finally gave him the name Bildad.
Well, in this passage here, verses 7 through 9, we see that God turns to Job's 3 friends and severely, and in my translation, which was the ESV that I used, or the NIV, I can't remember which one, I had a couple out, but uses the word, he angrily condemns Job's 3 friends. Yeah. That is a strong word, especially coming from Almighty God. He's angry with them.
Yeah.
Why is he angry? One of the things that I mentioned earlier and a couple weeks ago in our class is that they seem to have easy answers to Job's difficult questions. You ever run into people that whether it's a bloviator or not, it's almost somebody that feels like they have to answer every question.
Yeah.
And they look at it logically and in man's view. And he is reminding them, I am God. I am God. And
Opinions can never be justified if they're given without scriptural foundations.
That's true.
That's right.
I read something that says, be careful, do not try to play God in other people's lives.
That's right.
And I'm thinking of a person, I won't mention any names, who tends to kind of, I've got it figured out, let me tell you what God's told me to tell you.
Yeah.
It's like,
Yeah,
kind
real
of put
careful.
the discernment, meter goes off, and so I
That's right.
think that's why part of this is God was angry. Who are you to speak in my behalf to Job? He didn't like that.
Yeah, that's right.
I mean, they were the three friends, generally speaking, overall, we take in everything that they said. They were quick to assume that Job's suffering was because of his sin. And it wasn't.
Right? It's actually because of his righteousness.
That's exactly right.
The complete opposite.
That's right.
That's right.
Great point.
It was, Gary nailed it. It wasn't because of his sinfulness, because of his righteousness. And there's something to be said about that in the conversation. We go back to that conversation in chapter 1. He could have picked anybody.
Yeah,
But, I like to think of it as he picked his best guy.
yeah.
And
Which means he wouldn't have picked us,
Yeah.
which helps us a little bit.
all right. Sin is sometimes, suffering is sometimes a result of sin, but not always. So we need
That's
to be
right.
quick to keep that in mind. So those are some points under verses 7 through 9. And then the third area I'm going to look at or kind of focus in on is the rest of the chapter of God's restoration of his suffering servant. I find it kind of ironic and a bit of a paradox in the whole book that after 41 chapters describing Job and his calamities and all the long dialogues and back and forth between Job and between Job and his friends and Job and the Lord and God's response and Elihu, who we really don't speak about this week, but we remember him. We have just 7 verses on the restoration.
Right.
I find that just an interesting
Out of
paradox.
balance there.
I don't know what that means, but it just kind of struck me that it just wasn't a whole lot said about it. But what did that restoration look like? In verse 10, we read that he was made prosperous again, restored. Verse 11, we see how his brothers and sisters returned to him and comforted him and consoled him and brought him gifts of gold and silver through God's hand.
That's a good point. God's restoring him, but his family's still consoling him
That's right.
and comforting him. And, it doesn't mean he wasn't maybe having some still pains of the loss, but there was comfort there. And I think also, Richard, it's pretty significant. It says of all the adversities that the Lord had brought on him, not Satan had brought on him. The Lord brought on him. Again, we go back to that sovereignty of God.
Yeah.
God's sovereign over everything. This was really God's doing all along,
Yeah,
kind of thing.
by allowing Satan to,
That's right.
so.
Yeah.
Verse 12, I think, is significant, going a little bit beyond our lesson, but I think it certainly relates. It says that God blessed the latter part of Job's life more than the first.
Yeah.
Now think about how he was described in the opening chapters. He was pretty blessed. And I noted, too, that the numbers of the livestock, what he restored him with is exactly double what he had when he started out and what he lost. And then in verse 13 it says he also had 7 sons and 3 daughters.
Yeah.
What's that sound like, guys? That's what he had and lost.
Yeah, I forgot to, initially.
As far as the numbers. We see that in chapter 1. And then verse 16 it says, he lived 140 more years, seeing his children and their children to the 4th
That's
generation.
Yeah, I don't have a family picture that's got
Yeah.
great, whatever, so that's a lot of blessing.
Yeah, I think every family has a picture somewhere of however many generations they might have. I know in one case, I know of one that had 6.
Oh,
but
wow.
one that has 5 is a lot.
Oh,
That's a
yeah.
lot. That's
But
rare.
4 is kind of, wow, if you've
More
got 4, you're
typical.
certainly blessed. So, and that's what he's speaking about here. And then one thing that can be easily missed in this line-by-line account of what God restored and blessed Job with is that Job's friends are restored to God after God rebukes them and after the intercessory prayer of Job for his friends that's mentioned in verses 9 and 10.
That's right.
And it'd be easy in this litany of things that were restored to kind of skip over that.
Yeah.
But
Intercession.
praying for those friends, like Job did, is characteristic of somebody that, remember how God described Job back in the early part of the book? He said he was his servant. He said he was unique among all men on the earth. He was blameless, not sinless, but blameless, upright, God-fearing, and turns from evil or shuns evil. So the point I want to make there is we've seen all these qualities of Job that go far beyond what quality is usually associated with Job, and it's even evolved into a saying over the years that a person has the patience of Job. Yes, Job was a patient man, but I think it's important to go back and remind people of all of these things, not that people said of somebody else, what God said of Job. I think that's important. So in chapter 42, just kind of sum things up, we see that through the whole book, but then we see it in chapter 42, Job has come full circle from riches to ruin to riches through God's restoration.
Wow.
And I think that's an important point. And through it all, I think it's important to note this too, and perhaps we've done this. I'm sure most all of us have done this. We've questioned God in our suffering and in our difficult times, yes, but we didn't turn from Him.
That's right.
We're not to turn from Him. But Job teaches us to maintain our trust in God. And Job certainly, throughout, especially in the opening verses of this chapter, he declared his dependence on God in and through his suffering, just as he did in and through his affluence.
Yeah.
That's what we learn from this. And, Job went through, a season. Remember all the calamities that came on him remember the words that were used? One day.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One day. All of these things that would be overwhelming over the course of a lifetime, Job suffered in one day. So we could say that in the context of his entire life, the 140 years he was granted, and then all those leading up to that, we could call that this suffering a season of suffering. And what that alludes to here is God is going to restore.
Right.
The season of suffering may look like this is all we're going to have, but God does restore
That's right.
His faithful servants through it all. I think that's the lesson and kind of the period that we can put on the book of Job. And this is a great lesson. It's been a great book and really helps set the stage, too, for Ecclesiastes next week. So that's kind of how I'm planning to approach it. I hope that's been helpful. Tom and Gary,
Here, once you go now, close
interject.
us out with a thought or two.
We kind of, I mentioned earlier kind of when I saw the meat problem, and I mentioned that about and going from the God why to the God what, and I see that again. So I think that's the whole takeaway here. And I think, Brother Tom, you mentioned it several times ago. You're either in the midst of a trial, coming out of one, or getting ready to go into one. It's just life. And that's the takeaway is that life is not easy. There's a lot of bad things that happen. We can't always put our finger on why, but we can't stop trusting God because His ways are better and He knows what's best for us. And to have hope and trust in Him. So it's got to be the final takeaway is to never turn your back, never get angry, never get stuck in the God why into the question. It's always the God what question. So,
A couple things maybe. Richard, I think you hit a great point. Life group leaders, Richard mentioned about the intercession of Job. And you might want to develop that a little bit as you study and think about your lesson. because that's a pretty significant thing. I'm doing Wednesday night prayer service. Matt's on vacation, and I'm mentioning this in my
Yeah, that's
intercessory prayer theme tonight. That's a big thing. God said, go to Job. So Job interceded, and I think that's a big deal. Okay, I do, which you said I like too, Richard. The end is always better than the beginning for the Christian.
Yeah.
There's always seasons. Seasons has their limits for God's kids, and it's always better on the other side of it. Life group leaders, one thing you might want to be a little careful of is in verse 3, Job is responding to God, and he says, therefore I have declared that which I do not understand. And then he says, things too wonderful for me which I do not know. When you first see that word wonderful, your thought may be, well, he's saying everything that had happened to him is wonderful,
Oh, yeah.
and that's that can't be right. Well, that's not what he's saying. If you'll notice, he's speaking to God, and so his focus is on God. So instead of wonderful, you might say the wonder.
Yeah.
So he's talking about this wonder of God,
Yeah.
that God is in control, and not that all the stuff happened is wonderful to him. It's wonderful in the wonder and the awe of God. So that if you get a little, I got a little hung up right there on wonderful, and I had to think through that. Who's he addressing? God. So he's speaking about the wonder and the majesty and the awe of God. And that may help you a little bit, okay? Richard, that's all I got. Okay, Gary?
I read somewhere, I don't know where, can't remember, but it's also, there's no guarantee that we'll get double the
That's right.
blessing after a hard time or what. There's no 2 cups of this and a pound of that equals. So our reward, it may be an eternity with streets of gold and not more kids or grandkids or more livestock. So even though that happened in this story, we can't always say that when you go through bad times and God will bless you with a bigger house. I mean, we can't go there. So.
You'll have a keener sense of God.
Yeah.
And probably a reward there,
Right.
So. Okay, Richard.
That's all I got.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us, and hope this has been helpful. And we'll be praying for a blessed class for your class this coming Sunday.